Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We're slowly letting people in, and we'll start in a couple of minutes. Welcome, everyone. We will be starting in a minute, leaving some room for people to join the event. Okay, so we have an important topic to discuss, and I don't want to cut the time short, and I'll get started. People will be joining us as they slowly join the call. So my name is Elena Stavrevska. I'm a lecturer in international relations at the University of Bristol. I'm also a member of the Yugoslav Women Plus collective. It is a particular pleasure to be here today, even though virtually, as a former research officer at the LSE Center for Women, Peace and Security. So today I have the distinct honor to be joined by a truly stellar and really inspiring panel of speakers. In no particular order, I'll introduce them, although they don't really require a lot of introduction. So Dr. Ola Burljuk is an assistant professor of Europe's external relations at the University of Amsterdam, as well as an affiliate of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. Ola does research on EU efforts to transform third states and societies with her specific focus on Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Several of you on the call probably know that together with Vjosa, she is the co-editor of a forthcoming, very exciting special forum titled The Responsibility to Remain Silent on the Politics of Knowledge Production, Expertise, and Self-Reflection in Russia's War Against Ukraine. So today's event fits right in with that broader discussion. Then we also have Dr. Marina Shevtsova, who is a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Ljubljana, joining us today from Slovenia. She's also a senior FWO fellow at the Catholic University in Leuven, Belgium. Marina has published on LGBTI politics and value change in Ukraine and Turkey, as well as on LGBTQ plus activism in Central and Eastern Europe. She's currently working on an edited volume on this ongoing war, bringing together diverse contributions by Ukrainian feminist scholars and activists. So a very important intervention in the academic, but also the public space and discourse around the war. We also have today with us Dr. Vjosa Musliu, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the Free University in Brussels. Vjosa's research focuses on international interventions, EU external relations, and the way the EU creates and maintains its relations with its others, quote unquote, and how such practices also creep into academic work. So it's no surprise that she has published on this topic, specifically on Europeanization and state building as everyday practices in the Western Balkans, as well as on local critiques of state building in Kosovo. We also expect to have Oksana Potapova join us shortly, but I will introduce her if or when she joins. Those are the speakers, and the topic is one that is very familiar and strikes close to home to many of us who study or relate to conflict-affected societies more broadly in different personal or professional ways. So the event today explores questions around voice, expertise, as well as silence in debates of and about war more broadly, and specifically Russia's war against Ukraine. So even though there's been a lot of debates in academia, but also elsewhere, there has been a true saturation really of these debates regarding the war. Today's panel of speakers will be problematizing the subjects as well as the narratives that have dominated these discussions. Informed by the speakers' expertise, which is notable, as well as their experiences of this war, today we will be discussing the politics and materiality of feminist interventions in regards to the war, or better yet, the lack thereof. Briefly about the format. I will be asking 2 rounds of questions. Well, we're planning on 2 rounds of questions. Let's see how it goes. The first one will focus on disciplinary limits the policing and the disciplining around these limits, as well as the expectations in knowing or talking about Russia's war against Ukraine, especially in the West and Western academia. And then the second block of questions will focus on what kind of knowledge is being produced, encouraged, as well as allowed in regards to the current war. After about 60 minutes, we'll open it up for Q&A, but if you also have a question in the meantime, feel free to pop it in the chat and I'll ask it to the speakers. Finally, I should remind the audience that today's event is being recorded and this recording will be posted online after the event. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started with the questions. So my first question is to Marina. With the current war, there has been a lot of discussion, at least in the spaces that we access, regarding feminist approaches to war and war studies. But I'm curious, what kind of a mirror does the war hold up to these feminist approaches, and what can the feminist approaches, if not, what must they learn from how they have approached the war?
Good afternoon, everyone, or greetings to whoever might be watching us from different time zone or later in the recording. And thank you very much, Sarah, Elena, for the organization of this wonderful event, very timely and much needed, and Elena for wonderful moderation also, and disciplining us a little bit. Thank you very much, appreciated. Answering to your question, I've been thinking a lot about how academia, and particularly Western academia, to which I looked with certain admiration and looking for inspiration for many years, coming from, so to say, European periphery, right, from Ukraine. So I was really wondering how Western academia would respond to this war in Europe, the largest war in Europe since Second World War. And I actually had some illusions that were a little bit destroyed, and I will talk a little bit about this disappointment today, if I may. Of course, we immediately had this huge wave of support and solidarity within across whole Europe, across Western world, and much solidarity, especially among ordinary people. We saw people, getting together and providing everything, like from their housing, money, from political support, words of support to everyone. And so we also saw much solidarization, much solidarity within academia. But at the same time, one thing that I would like to stress in this war, and I think it's been discussed already and it will be more discussed, is that, of course, this war is a pivotal point and a very unique point from the perspective of feminist studies, of gender studies scholarship on the war, in the sense that there is a lot already written saying that wars usually are the ones that cement, so to say, gender roles, traditional gender roles, that wars lead to retraditionalization of the society. And this was pretty much expected, not only from, ordinary reaction. You see that media is very much is tending to portray, for example, Ukrainian women more as victims, and there is a lot of talk about how to protect them, Ukrainian women with kids and so on. And also it is somehow seen in the works of Western feminists and scholars saying that women should be, protected as victims of rape, victims of Russian soldiers and so on. And this is, of course, the case in many situations. But what also this war showed us is that Ukrainian women actually took very different stance, and we see very high numbers of Ukrainian women joining the military, fighting their fight, both in the front line, but also, in the home front, taking very traditionally male positions, being empowered by struggling for the democracy in Ukraine and for the independence. And having said this, and of course, we see now much admiration, because these are very attractive and appealing titles for articles to portray Ukrainian women soldiers and to tell about them, how, a woman who used to have makeup and look very traditionally feminine goes to the front line and is killing, enemies. But at the same time, we see interesting reaction when it comes to giving weapons to these women. So as you know, there was much response at the international level to Russian aggression in Ukraine, part of it humanitarian aid and part of it, of course, military aid. And then what came with this providing military aid to Ukraine, because of course Ukraine is incapable to, supply itself with necessary amount of weapons to resist to such a big enemy as Russia. such a big country aggressor. So of course, from the very beginning, Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people have been asking for support, for military support. And then what we saw and what really struck me was the huge wave of criticism coming from Western feminist activists, queer activists, Western gender studies scholars, who were actually very critical of the whole idea of helping Ukraine with weapons and with military supplies. And even maybe some of you know that, or maybe many of you know that there was this feminist manifesto against war signed by some leading feminist scholars, but also by many activists whose names maybe are not so well known, where they criticize NATO, calling NATO co-responsible for the war in Ukraine, and where they say that, well, Ukrainians should just give up on their territories, should just sit peacefully and discuss with Russia, you know, what's going on, because people are dying. And so somehow the situation is distorted. And the main problems that I see with this, or two main problems that I see with this approach is, first, as I said, it distorts the situation. It presents what's going on not as the war with the occupation coming from one terrorist state aggressor, which kind of wants to take independence, wants also to destroy countries' national identity, culture, and actually genocide that is now taking place at the Ukrainian territory. But also with calling for, you know, not giving weapons to Ukrainian military, not helping Ukraine, Western scholars deprive Ukrainian women of agency and subjectivity to actually be able and be knowledgeable enough to decide what they need. And what they need are weapons, because what I think is extremely important as imperative is actually to make a strong difference between violence as a violence of aggressor, as Russian state as aggressor, and violence that a victim of oppressor or survivor of the oppression is legitimized or is justified to use. Because when, you know, of course, Ukrainian feminists, and there was a very well-written response by Ukrainian feminists to this manifesto, where they were saying that, of course, we oppose violence as such, we oppose racism, xenophobia, sexism, capitalism, imperialism, and this is against what Ukrainian feminists have been fighting for years and continue during the war, right? And we continue discussing the issues of racism, of homo and transphobia, of being more equal, of targeting structural inequality. But now the essential need that we have is to survive and to stand up for our territory and for integrity of our territory, for our freedom and for democracy, not only in Ukraine, but in Europe. And for that, we need weapons. And with this weapon, we are knowledgeable, qualified, and competent to decide what to do. And I think this is a very important, I would like to stop somewhere here. This is a very important part of discussion that should be ongoing, how much agency is given to Ukrainians and to Ukrainian women in particular by Westerners, you know, because I think in these 10 months, Ukraine has proven, and Ukrainian people have proven, that they are able, apt to fight and to stand up for their freedom and independence. But for some reason, we are still very often as seen as minor brothers, or, you know, less competent ones who have to be told and guided what to do, how to fight. I will stop probably here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so picking up on some of the last points that you made about knowing and trying to understand the agency and recognizing really Ukrainian feminists as knowers in their own right, I want to turn the next question towards Vjosa and ask, what has this war shown us in terms of how little, or maybe how much overall, we know or knew earlier of Ukraine as well as of Russia? And what is this difference that we potentially see of knowing Ukraine through Russia, speaking with Ukraine, and sometimes speaking over Ukraine as well as Ukrainian knowers and subjects?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Elena and Sarah, for putting all of this together and for giving us the opportunity to continue this conversation yet again in another forum. I will try to tackle the questions that you posed, Elena, also in light to what Marina just explained. I am wary of the time, so please, do signal when I have overuse the allocated time. Before I maybe begin to talk about what the war as such has shown us about dynamics of knowledge production in IR, because this is a discipline where I operate, where most of us in this virtual room anyway operate, it is probably imperative to just situate the full-blown war of Russia against Ukraine, to begin with, as devastating and disruptive that it was for all children, the elderly, the young, men, women, and the queer. Somewhat paradoxically, or maybe not, this full-blown war quickly downgraded to the evil of some men and the heroism of other men. This is the aesthetics of the war that we see anyway. The insignificant others, mainly women, the queer people, the disabled, the children, almost naturally became either collateral damage or victims in need for protection, as was mentioned by Marina. Now, notwithstanding the amplification of voices and perspectives that we have thanks to this technological proliferation, with Russia's war against Ukraine, what we are experiencing is yet again what Svetlana Alexievich has called the unwomanly face of the war. It took quite a bit of time, and it is taking continuously more time for feminist interventions and interruptions from feminist voices to disrupt the narrative of the war. But to go back to your question, maybe this whole constellation showed us just how little we knew Ukraine and how little we knew of Ukraine. And when I say we, I mean centers of knowledge production in the Western academia. When I say the Western academia, I'm talking about universities primarily and think tanks where public opinion is shaped in Western Europe and North America. So when the full-blown war started, the overwhelming narrative in IR circles in this hemisphere made it seem as if the academic and the expert community suddenly discovered the war. It was almost as if the war came out of nowhere. It was almost as if it was completely uncalled for, unprepared for. Almost as if the full-blown war was not a continuation of the events during and after the Maidan protests in 2014 and the subsequent annexation of Crimea shortly after. The questions and the problematizations in the majority of IR circles absolved almost entirely and uncritically the developments in Crimea and Russia's occupation in the east of Ukraine over the past 8 years. Now, in many IR conferences that I attended myself until the very full-blown war in February 22, the annexation of Crimea was a mere appendix in IR debates, if it was debated at all to the full extent and what it meant for Ukraine primarily and what it meant for the potential of a full-blown war. And the idea here was something like, if it does not make it to our news outlets, it does not exist. If it does not make it to our news outlets, it probably is not that big of a deal. And when the full-blown war started, we were confronted yet again with this epistemic awakening. We had our Ukrainian colleagues telling us, sometimes in English, sometimes in German, sometimes in Ukrainian, and sometimes in Russian, we told you so. We have been talking about a full-blown war long ago. The question is, who is at the listening end and who ought to listen? And at the same time, who decides who is a legitimate subject of knowledge that we ought to listen to? Against this backdrop, because I will also talk about not knowing Russia possibly at a later stage, but against this backdrop, we suddenly, after the full-blown war, we suddenly discovered the Ukrainian subject. It was as if the Ukrainian subject only emerged now. The Ukrainian subject, i.e. the Ukrainian intellectual, the Ukrainian scholar, the Ukrainian feminist. And to go back to Gayatri Spivak, suddenly the Ukrainian could speak. We realized that the Ukrainian not only speaks, we also had this shocking revelation that the Ukrainian subject does not speak Russian, right? We were also confronted with this epistemic conundrum that we had learned about Ukraine and we had studied Ukraine through Russian, through centers of knowledge, primarily in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And we had created a particular idea about what Ukraine was without necessarily talking to the Ukrainian and with the Ukrainian subject. I will leave it here and go back maybe to more discussion about knowing and not knowing Russia, knowing and not knowing war at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Vjosa. Indeed, I think there is a discovery that the Ukrainian can speak, but even then, there's the question of in what format, how, within what limit can the Ukrainian speak and know, and in what spaces. So, Ola, you have been the designated Ukrainian in quite a few spaces, as you yourself have mentioned. So I would like to invite you to please potentially reflect and unfortunately do the intellectual labor for us to explain a little bit what it means for scholars from, and in your case also of Ukraine, to be this designated Ukrainian in intellectual discussion.
Thank you, Yelena. Indeed, I will now pick up on some of the things that Marina and Vjosa had mentioned in terms of the general debate and the general tendencies, and try to illustrate those from the experience of an individual person who is trying to generate knowledge. And as you is the designated Ukrainian, you know, like the designated survivor title of an American TV series. I'm the designated Ukrainian because often I would be the one and only Ukrainian in the room, right? And yeah, looking back at this whole experience, I wonder what was it? And the most accurate description now is it was field work. I've been studying Ukraine. I've been studying Ukraine in the context of European Union, European integration, European processes. I've been studying Ukraine in the context of international relations, geopolitics, the broader post-Soviet region for 10, 15 years. And I've never had my work as I did in this past year. And of course, we can say whether, you know, that was justified or not, opportunistic or not, you know, the interest. Acknowledgement here that in many ways, Ukraine is even privileged to get this attention because some other wars and conflicts and revolutions don't even get the momentarily attention, you know, when they just start happening, right? But indeed, since end of February, I've turned more or less into a talking head, giving endless guest lectures to colleagues in my university, but also within the Netherlands, Belgium, and just more or less anywhere. But also talking to media, also going to various public policy events. Also, the latest curiosity is expert meetings of various government processes in Flanders and in the Netherlands, where they're trying to reflect on their policy and how to adjust that. And it's been at a rate, at a pace, and demanding in such a way that it turned me into a talking head and made me absolutely unable to write. Right? Because when you're constantly commenting, you need to stay on top of what's the latest, and you have absolutely no time to actually put on paper the thoughts you have articulated for a particular meeting or during that meeting, right? And often I have colleagues who reach out like, hey, can I cite you on that? Can I cite you on that? Did you write it somewhere? Did you already publish it somewhere? Is it at least on the record somewhere, you know, like a recorded public lecture? Because, you know, we've heard you say this and that and that and that, but it's not, you know, we cannot cite you for this because it's not registered anywhere. Also, I repeatedly wondered in what capacity am I in the meeting, right? Because I imagine that I'm a professor, so I'm being invited as a scholar of Ukraine, but maybe I'm invited as an expert on Ukraine, fit to comment on anything and everything to do with Ukraine, or am I maybe invited as an advocate for Ukraine, and maybe I should take on that role and just, you know, put forward Ukraine's message or whatever, because often it felt like in some meetings, even when people would say the word Ukraine, just the word Ukraine in their own narrative of what they're saying, they would look at me or point at me. So I felt like I was the Ukraine, in the room, not only the Ukrainians. Or am I just a curiosity, just a person from Ukraine, they just to have a living Ukrainian in the room to tell us, the nitty gritty, sexy facts from the field of how it actually looks in practice, right? So there's this mixed roles, and with them, unclear expectations. And sometimes I would just find myself swirling between them, just depending on what's happening, what the others are saying, the questions they're asking, and just adjust to that in the moment. Also, when you're introduced, I've been introduced as Ms. Burluk, Ukrainian political scientist. And sometimes I would ask, like, what exactly do you mean? Why do you add Ukrainian there? Why am I not Dr. Burluk, political scientist? Like that's what I'm doing, and I have been doing for a long time. Or maybe you want to specify that I'm from Ukraine, or maybe I'm a scholar of Ukraine. But even wondering what would real Ukrainian political scientists, meaning political scientists working in and from Ukraine, would they even agree with me being labeled that way? Indeed, to add to that, as we mentioned from the start, I would often be the only Ukrainian in the room, and then sometimes also the only woman, and the only migrant, and also the only non-native speaker if this would be a discussion, in English or in Dutch, especially if it was in Dutch. So I started joking that I'm this perfect person that fits multiple quotas in one person. I fulfill the demand for diversity in several respects at once. So not in all respects, but in many respects. And indeed, should I feel flattered that I've been invited when nobody else was, or like, should I even bother in this debate if I'm outnumbered by such huge numbers? Right, so I could be the one speaker, one of 2, one of 5, one of 15, one in a room of 20 experts, right? So the balance would be different, but usually I would be the only one. And I wonder, like, did they even invite others? Just nobody could make it, or was it just enough to have one me, so that the event, was legitimized, right? And that brings me to, what do you even do there, right? As a scholar of Ukraine, or an expert, or an advocate, or a human being, right? What do you do there? And in the beginning, I thought, like, okay, I'm going there to inform the debate, and maybe I'm going there to influence the debate. I'm one of the voices in the debate. And I was like, no, I'm not influencing anything. I think I'm just going there to inform the debate, right? I just like feed facts and tell them how things are seen from Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So empirical donor, I call it. I've been the empirical donor. I'm just informing the debate. Then, of course, you get suspicious. Am I just there to legitimize the debates? I was there. This was a discussion, and if I wasn't there, maybe it wouldn't have been. So maybe I should, like, check, not even go there. Especially with time, you realize that the learning curve is very flat at a very low angle. So much so that, still in October, November, I could probably deliver the same lecture I was delivering in March with minor adjustments, just changes the duration of the war, and the same, kind of points that need making are still relevant because this hasn't settled, in the mainstream interpretation of the events. So then you wonder, is there any effect at all from our collective effort, right? Because it's not just me, it's not that I'm so special. More or less every Ukrainian who speaks a foreign language has been taken up, within their specific area of residence and within their own networks, disciplinary and such, geographic networks, and has been doing more or less the same. And now I've reached the point where I think this was field work. This was me doing field work on how knowledge is produced, what's considered expertise, what's considered relevant. And yeah, I'm trying to articulate some conclusions in that regard. And I'll wrap up and I'll tell you more later. Thanks.
Thank you, Ola. Indeed, as I said, it also feels ethically questionable to demand more intellectual labor, more emotional labor with that as well, from people who have been doing this educating since February and long before as well, but intensely since February. So I, and I'm sure everyone in the audience as well, really, really appreciate you sharing your reflections today. Oksana has joined us in the meantime, right? Oksana, can you turn on your camera if you're here?
Yes, I am.
Ah, there you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, let me just introduce you real quick. So Oksana Potapova is an activist and a PhD student at the Department of Gender Studies at LSE. Born and raised in the east of Ukraine, Oksana has been involved in addressing the aftermath of the conflict in Donbass since 2014. It was, in fact, her activist experience that led to her interest in embodied feminist methodologies and to advocacy of intersectionality within the WPS agenda. Oksana combines activism with research and advocacy for feminist peace and grassroots movement building in Ukraine. And we're very happy to have her with us today. So throwing you right to the deep end, Oksana, we have been talking a little bit about this urgency that comes with this particular war, but also with other wars around the world as they unfold. So could you tell us a little bit about the temporal aspect of knowledge production around Russia's war against Ukraine, especially around contexts that, I mean, Ukraine, but also more broadly contexts that get this rapid attention, not only the urgency that comes with these opportunities to speak, but also the sustainability potentially of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, colleagues, and my apologies for being a bit late. I'm now at a conference on preventing sexual violence and conflict, which very much pertains to knowledges about unfortunately human rights violations and sexual violence, not only in Ukraine. And a lot of the things I've been thinking a lot about knowledge production and this aspect of urgency of the issues as well. But I want to start by saying that I started kind of looking more into the temporality of decision-making priorities and knowledge production, also through my work in Ukraine and my reflections on that work in my academic research, where in Ukraine, we have this phrase that is used often, which is called "ne na chasi." It's not the time for something, which is one of the ways for politicians and anti-gender or gender kind of critical, gender skeptical conservatives to say, now is not the time to deal with gender and to deal with your women's rights. We'll wait after. So this is an argument actually for urgency and timeliness of this agenda. But it also, when we started working with the internally displaced women, women affected by war in Ukraine, and looking at what security and political participation means to them, these temporal aspects started coming up more and more in all the different nuanced ways. For example, the timing of kindergartens, how long they work, also determine, how much free time the woman who has childcare responsibilities has in her day to engage in other things, and whether she has even access to that infrastructure. And so shifting it from this individual, manage your time better, be more efficient kind of logic of neoliberal, labor to understanding more this power and structural power relations behind managing time as a resource. Feminist optics kind of help us understand that it's often about power relationships that manifest themselves in material or immaterial structures of power. And I started to kind of look more into what it means to have a say about temporality of anything. Who gets to say how urgent something is, or how much time it should take to do this and that work, and why that decision is being made. And usually, in structures of hierarchical power, where kind of feedback from below is not present, those time estimations are serving the agendas or the realities of the powerful, and sometimes the urgency of something is not in, like, for example, Ukrainian women have been saying, women's rights agenda and security concerns in our region because of Russia are urgent, and they have been saying this for 8 years, and now all of a sudden the West has also decided that they are urgent. So I think in kind of following those not only kind of claims of it's time for this or it's time for that, but also looking at who is making those claims at what moment can tell us a lot about power and how it operates. And I think as feminists, we can disrupt those claims by actually claiming that some things are more urgent than they seem, or that some things take more time and should be kind of prolonged. Because coming back to knowledge production and the urgency around it, this temporal aspect becomes also a very useful tool of avoiding structural change when an emergency response has limited temporality and also has limited resources. In cases of knowledge production around Ukraine, I personally have encountered this kind of an overflow of demands for presentations and speeches, and I had to also discern for myself in what cases, as my previous colleague was saying, I am just a token Ukrainian, and should I, dedicate my time to this conference or to this panel discussion, or should I, use my time more strategically? And this is not to brag, but to say that the demand has really grown. At the same time, there is this looming assumption at the back, like, I have to do it now. I cannot say no to any conference because I know that, the attention will die down after this community of scholars has taken up their goodwill and found the funding for this conference, for this workshop, but they won't be able to find this funding again. So I have to go. And then following this workshop, they are proposing us to produce a publication. And of course, some big publisher suddenly is very willing to make that publication very quickly. And that means you have to sit down and write a really rigorous academic text in really short timeframes, which usually, those of us involved in writing academically know how long it takes to actually produce a good quality text. And then you fall into this trap of, third world or like developing countries, however they label us, academics cannot produce good quality text. And so some things that deserve more time and investment. And I started checking with myself also as somebody involved in these processes, kind of in an embodied way, telling myself, am I operating out of a sense of scarcity, a sense of this opportunity will not come again, or out of a sense of, there is, an abundance, or there is this agenda will be relevant. And I have to negotiate with the world all the time. But I think I can assume and I can suspect that many of my colleagues, also from other contexts that are not centered in the West, that do not kind of form the agenda, experience the same thing. And at least naming it and starting to question and challenge it could be a feminist intervention. When also we talk about now these emergency grants that will be running out after a year of scholars at risk ending their programs in universities, does it mean they're no longer at risk after this program is over? Where are they supposed to continue their research after that? And how does that work? Or will they be transferred to tenured positions, or will they be offered jobs in universities? Are they supposed to? It kind of intersects with labor relations as well, and migration. There's many layers to it, but I feel like this temporal limitation of now urgently there is a lot and you have to take it because afterwards there will be nothing and we go back to zero, are underscoring the fact that the system doesn't really want to change and understand that a long-term investment is what leads to quality research, to quality transformation, and to basic sense of security as well. As somebody who is involved in intellectual work, I argue for the same things, this will be my last comment, for the same kind of perspective on funding feminist movements on the ground, which have been talking about this for generations as well. In order to achieve transformative change with our policymakers, with our communities, we need flexible long-term funding. And that hasn't materialized itself either. So there seems to be an overarching logic there in different domains, which I haven't found solutions on how to transform, but at least I'm starting to name it. And I think maybe that will give more imagination to next steps.
Thank you, Oksana. And those of us working or from the Western Balkans know all too well how at some point people will start asking you, why are you still talking about the war? Of course, funding will dry out. Not to be the pessimist here, but we've seen this before, unfortunately. But going back to Vjosa's point about, or invoking Spivak on the Ukrainian being able to speak. I think in a lot of these discussions where you're invited to speak, and I appreciate there's been plenty of invitations, I think there's also an expectation of how you get to speak, what you get to speak. especially in the context of Western modernity, of expectation around rational subject, objective knower. So I want to turn our attention towards what kind of knowledge is being produced, what we count as knowledge, and who is encouraged and allowed to think, to know, but also to feel. So my first question is to you, Marina, if you could reflect a little bit on this right to be emotional while knowing or as part of knowing.
Yes, thank you very much. And I wanted to thank also Oля, Oksana, and Vjosa for everything said already, because it's like to build so nicely one upon each other. And indeed, this is a very painful topic for me that I'm so relieved I can at least discuss, with you today. I've been thinking about writing about it for quite some time. And this is exactly not only what knowledge are we expected to produce and how we expected to write, but also how we are expected to deliver this knowledge and how we are expected to present it. And I was speaking in the beginning by this rejection or denying Ukrainians the right for self-determination, for fighting with weapons against the aggressor. And now I wanted to also speak about the denying us the right to actually be emotional and speak our hearts. And I think it is very interesting that academia overall, and if we talk about IR or political science, at least I know this field a bit better, kind of already recognize the importance of emotions, right? So there are already so many works about role of emotions and affect, and how emotions are being used to mobilize masses, and how it is important to gain the voters, and so on and so that. And it seems that we even now acknowledge that emotional intelligence is not less important than, say, cognitive abilities, and there are these expensive trainings on that. Till when it comes to academic presentation and knowledge production, the researcher, the scholar with this capital S, is expected to be unemotional, rational, being able to somehow, we speak of positionality, we're expected to step out of this box in which we are usually, put, and somehow be able to see everything like from outside and, discuss all pros and contras. And in this, I remembered one story when I was preparing my short input for that. I remembered I was at the ILGA World. This is, International Gay Lesbian conference where there was a mix of presentations by scholars and activists, and there was a panel on trans rights. And there was this British scholar who was talking about, she had a very high quality research, I believe, and then she was speaking about her finding, which was, she said, well, I believe that if trans activists were less emotional and were less, more strategic in delivering their claims and like arguing for what they need, they would be heard more, because all this emotionality and all this cries and all this being so exotic, so to say, this doesn't add you credibility. And I remember, and I admit it now, that when she was saying this, I kind of listened and said, yeah, of course, this is kind of insulting, but it makes sense, because if you are a minority, you want to be heard, you need to be rational, you need to strategize, And now, after those years, I ended up in the position, I will come back to that presentation again. I ended up in the same position. I'm, as Ola and Oksana said, I'm this designated Ukrainian in many spaces, and sometimes I end up on the panels with Russian scholars, and sometimes, of course, usually there's not scholars who say that Putin regime is the best, but sometimes they do start saying that not everything is like it seems, that we should be, we should sit and discuss calmly, we should negotiate. That what about Ukrainian nationalism? What about Azov regiment? But what about, And I, as many of my colleagues, I didn't have experience of running from the bombings, but I have my family there, and I have experience of checking the news every morning, and days when my family doesn't have any connection, and I know that there are rockets falling in my city. So, in all this, we are all expected to be calm and to find energy and forces to respond to that. And sometimes something that is very insulting. For example, once I was told to stop speaking English and switch to Russian because I know it, and this was seen as okay. Or once at the big international conference, I actually heard things about how Ukrainian refugees are very privileged with blue eyes and blonde hair, and how they are treated with, with a lot of luxury. And I was the only Ukrainian in that room, probably. So I actually couldn't find forces to even listen until then, and I went out. And then I know that a colleague of mine who is there here today, I saw her name, she basically, stepped in, and I know the repercussions that she had for that. There were implications. Once you allow yourself to be a little bit emotional, and this is, I want to also say that this is extremely gendered. So once a female academic, you allow yourself to show a bit of emotion, you are labeled immediately as unbalanced, hysterical, weak, unobjective. And, and this means that you cannot produce that credible knowledge. So people will probably listen to you. They will say, yeah, oh, who are you? Oh, you have families there, of course. So how can we expect you to, to discuss rationally? But at the same time, and, I remember at the same time, you have this pressure when hearing this. For me, it is okay if they dismiss me. And I know for many of my colleagues, it's not about our arrogance or, for not being respected enough, but it's also pressure because every time we speak like this, we understand that people see in us other Ukrainians too. So we kind of speak on behalf of other Ukrainians, even though nobody, nobody gave us this responsibility. It kind of comes as this label. Okay, now you represent other Ukrainian women, so you have to represent them with dignity. Comes with a lot of pressure. So I'm asking myself, I remember the trans woman who responded back, and she said, you know what, my sisters are now being killed on the streets. We're being bitten by the police every day. Every day in the world, one trans person is dying. Maybe I have the right to speak emotionally, and I will continue emotionally because I am who I am. And I think we shouldn't deny ourselves this right, but I also think we should ask ourselves, is this a feminist space? Is this academic solidarity that we are trying to build the one that denies Ukrainians, people from Balkans, people from other countries struggling with conflicts, wars, any other kinds of inequality? Is this the feminist solidarity which can deny us this right to be emotional and speak with emotions? Because I think we lose when we take those emotions out of our research, of our activism, of our action. So I think maybe, and this will be my last sentence, maybe we should try instead for ways how we can accommodate actually our emotions and help us to guide us in our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. Yes, indeed. I mean, this leads to, well, not only frustration, but also this disembodied knowledge that means very little in the end, right? I mean, the question oftentimes is just about how much we leave out as how much we present. But on this point of being emotional, I want to turn to Ola with the question of who is emotional? Is it just the Ukrainians that are emotional, or are there more in these discussions that are in fact emotional?
Yes, thank you. So I was going through this meeting after meeting, lecture after lecture, lecture after lecture, right? And these would be on all types of subjects. And I would actually do the emotional labor of just, I'm here as the scholar. I've, do a breathing exercise before so that I don't start crying, and I'm super professional and super controlled, giving them a super censored down version, not at all as radical as somebody in Ukraine zooming in would have told them. I've adjusted on every level to make sure I'm impactful in this type of discussion. And then at the end, I'm being publicly thanked for having made such a valuable emotional contribution. And once even I've been thanked for being so authentic and given the authentic say. And I'm like, I've literally been feeding you public opinion survey data. Like, how was that authentic? So like, okay, how is that done? And then in parallel, this process would be happening. We're like, but you're Ukrainian, right? Right? You're Ukrainian, right? So we're going to talk on the effect of sanctions on Russian oligarchs. But we will first ask you, how's your family? Is your family all right? And I'm like, why is that relevant? Why are you emphasizing I'm Ukrainian? Like, are you trying to say that because that somehow gives me more credit and, kind of to voice my credentials? By the way, she's Ukrainian. She knows what she's talking about. But you do realize you're announcing my bias to the world, to saying like, by the way, she's Ukrainian. Don't listen to anything she has to say, divided by 2, by 5, by 10. A third tendency that was happening is that people were somehow assuming I was emotional and they were not. And in one conversation with a journalist, I literally called him out and I said, you know what? You're also like, you're right. This is very emotional for me. I'm very concerned for Ukraine. And it's also emotional for you. your emotion is indifference. You literally don't care about what's happening. And that's why you give the advice you give and you take the position you take. It was a case at hand was a Dutch journalist. So I said, you know, imagine Germany took over Limburg and Brabant, and the whole world is telling you, you know what, the Netherlands stands no chance. Just, you know, stop fighting for peace, stop fighting to save women, you know, stop fighting to save lives and to heal the world. I was like, do you think you'd be given, you know, the same advice you give in Ukraine if you had a different emotion, you know, not indifference and complete detachment from the subject, but actually, you know, some kind of involvement? And you know that once I kind of had this bold calling out, it really liberated me in any further interaction. And I started paying attention to how actually people's cognitive contributions to the debate, their limits of their imagination, of the analytical, abstract, you know, solutions to the problems, or, you know, possible ways things might evolve, how that's conditioned by emotions, right? And then beyond the concern of the Ukrainians and those who have worked on Ukraine closely, on the region closely, it doesn't even have to be Ukrainians, those who are like truly concerned about what's happening, and those who don't care at all. I think in the bubble of experts commenting on Russia's war in Ukraine, there are two other very strong emotions. In the pool of experts who come from the fields of IR and political science, if we zoom in, usually it's people who commenting on, you know, Russia, politics, geopolitics, EU, okay, those who've been trained in IR and political science, they often, and those who get the microphone, right? So men who are 50 plus, and, you know, who get the microphone, have actually the authority in the room. They've been very much trained in the classical IR and the Cold War mentality, Russia is to be feared. And this kind of conscious, subconscious, or even unconscious emotion that censors the pool of options that they come up with and shapes their cognitive thinking, you know, their rational thinking, is the emotion of fear. You know, Russia is to be feared, either because it's big and important or because it's crazy, right? So motivations are different. You know, either it's an important nuclear power or it's a monkey with a nuclear button, but either way, it's to be feared. And that really shapes what they can come up with, to the point that I had to cite Ukrainian social media and say, well, in Ukraine, people ask, what does it matter if 10,000 Ukrainians die from a nuclear bomb or 10,000 Ukrainians die from daily missiles? Like, what's the difference for the West? You know, what's in it for you, right? Now, the second pool of experts commenting on the war come from area studies, and area studies is usually Russia studies, and people often end up in Russia studies by the sheer nature of having studied Russian. And Russian, they usually have studied in the departments, you know, for Russian language and literature, Russian language and culture, Russian language and society, right? And they've selected this because they were already somehow fascinated by the mysterious Russian soul. And then for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, they've been professionally trained to love all things Russian. And their strong emotion is love. And they are going through an identity crisis because the object of love is disproving, you know, everything that they've thought about it, and they cannot accept the fact. And, you know, that this love is what kind of shades everything they have to think and have to say, because they're hoping that, you know, it can be saved. The object of love can come out well out of this, you know, without the collapse of the regime, without the suffering to the people, you know, with all good Russians personally named and listed, you know, not to be forgotten in history that they've been the good, right? And this strong emotion of love. So I would say that we're all emotional and just different emotion shades the rational outputs of our brains. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. Indeed, and thank you both, Marina and Ola, for highlighting these politics of emotions and the disciplining that comes. I mean, I know I've said this word many times today, but really the disciplining that comes with what kind of emotion is expected from who is authentic by being emotional, and who is just rational by being emotional in their own right or way. So to zoom out a little bit, I would like to go to Oksana now. And as we're slowly navigating towards the end of the event, Oksana, you spoke earlier about the urgency that comes with this knowledge production, or either by relegating the gender to, as Cynthia Enloe says, the patriarchal time zone of later, or by pushing for knowledge about or from Ukraine being produced now. But the big question is, who is this knowledge produced with? Who is it produced with? Who is it produced for? Who is it produced with? And ultimately, who benefits from the final product? Especially, and I think this is an important question to ask also in today's forum, especially because this is happening within the limits of Western academia in some ways. So if you could address that question, would value your insight.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, indeed. Again, as I think as a feminist researcher, this is I'm trying to kind of continuously put this question at the center of my my own academic work. As feminist research ethics invite us to think about knowledge also as a tool of power, as a structure of power that either kind of reinforces the existing structures or serves to emancipate, support, empower those that are we are often whose experiences we are trying to kind of center, that are usually marginalized. And in that regard, language or different types of language come into play as as tools of gatekeeping or as opportunities for opening spaces. And here I'm speaking about specifically like language linguistically, as someone who my first master's degree is English and French interpretation, and I think I took for granted the fact that from the very beginning of my professional journey, I spoke fluent English, and it opened me doors to a lot of spaces inside Ukraine, internationally, and also eventually to the academia, where I also had to learn the language of the jargon and the wording and the structure, which is how language is used and conceptually. And until recently, at a forum, a feminist forum in Ukraine, I had a conversation about this gap between the push for hiring local staff in international organizations in order to ensure inclusivity, in order to ensure sensitivity of humanitarian programs. There is a lot of organizations coming into Ukraine right now to do work with different degrees of effectiveness. And the push of feminist community was, don't assume you know everything, hire local staff. And then the next step of that was, well, the local staff that they're trying to hire, the expectation is fluent English as part of the CV. And it's such a given to every international. And I think, in a way, I've also learned to kind of assume that it's a given and to justify this demand. But how many of these internationals have budgets for learning Russian or Ukrainian themselves, in our case, specifically Ukrainian, when they come to the field, and whether that politics of language expectation is reversed. But that also made me realize that the spaces where knowledge is produced about Ukraine or even from Ukraine in English and the space where the same knowledge is produced in our own language are two different spaces, and they sometimes don't overlap unless there are people like us who basically serve as these translators of knowledge spaces by including citations, by referencing our colleagues even in original languages, and bringing to the forefront their expertise. And I really don't have an answer to how to address this system, because it is very much centered in the West. And I think we sort of accepted this assumption that English is the international language of knowledges, disrupting that is a long journey, is a long exercise, also a structural one. But again, I think highlighting and putting it to the fore is important. In case of Ukraine, in fact, we are kind of in a double colonial bind, because while English is being kind of the language of this new kind of Western world that we're trying to join, we're also trying to decolonize ourselves from the domination of Russian language in a lot of knowledges that has been produced inside Ukraine and about Ukraine, but from a perspective of either Russian imperialism or from a Russian-speaking perspective, which is also different. And I think that is an interesting positionality as well, which creates a lot of complications, but also potentially, I hope it will, encourage us to learn this nuance and understanding why giving more space to languages that are not present and to people who speak those languages in accessing knowledge and creating knowledge and generating knowledge, and actually putting responsibility and the onus on those who have more power and resources to making those knowledges available and accessible is important. And the other type of languages is, of course, something that you've already been discussing about, how do we speak and how do we express the knowledge and how do we communicate? Because in that regard, the language of emotions is also a language with its own messaging and its own ways of reading and communicating things. Embodiment is a language. And are we, inviting ourselves to these different expressions and ways of communicating that are equally valid? I think my answer is that we still live in a world of very much hierarchy of these types of knowledges and types of languages. I think I really hope that as we kind of grab onto this process of decolonization, which really has become central to Ukrainian cultural sphere and political conversations with Russia's full-scale invasion, will really allow us to think about plurality and about the effort that it takes to decenter ourselves in linguistic terms as well, because languages are and have been tools of imperial domination, colonization, and centrism of the world in certain parts of, and maybe as the Western academia is at least claiming to try to decolonize itself, and maybe as there is more push for that from different locations, from different parts of the world that are seeking to be more in the center and from the margins, maybe we will see plurality and different practices that allow plurality of languages, linguistic practices to come into the mainstream knowledge space.
Thank you, Oksana. I appreciate that you're ending on a hopeful note. And I think it's important to also acknowledge that there has been actual movement in this direction. We see more and more collective work being done, different type of work, different type of knowledge being acknowledged, spaces being created for this kind of knowledge to be discussed. So is it mainstream? No, but do we aim to mix with the main and the male stream? I'm not entirely sure. So I think sometimes we also have to pick our battles on where we want to have certain conversations. And with that, I'll turn to Vjosa, both to the question that you kind of left hanging due to lack of time in the first round, which is about knowing Russia, but also zooming out even bigger than Oksana, and reflecting a little bit perhaps on who gets to write, who writes actually about war and peace in IR, who thinks, who has the headspace and the academic space to talk about war and peace within international relations, and what can we learn, if anything, from this?
Thank you, Elena. I will try to bring the two together, to talk about how little we knew Russia and we knew of Russia in IR, and also who gets to talk about war, about peace, and who gets to strategize about war and peace. Now, granted, as you mentioned before, we have quite a bit, we in the Balkans have quite a bit of an experience with that. And, colleagues from Ukraine, you might brace for a lot of research that is coming up on post-conflict, post-war reconstruction, with all kinds of ideas on how you can rebuild your Ukraine, and, what are the best models to do with, and what are the best practices. So there will come a lot of pedagogical, if it is not already underway, a lot of pedagogical politics on how to build state, how to be a feminist, what kind of feminist you should be, and all of these layers of pedagogical, financial, military, and humanitarian intervention that are co-constitutive of one another after all. But I want to start, maybe talk about the knowledge production by referring back to something Aida Hozic said on Twitter in the first week of the war, when the war started. One of the things that I noted down from that time is she said, to colleagues in IR, do not use Ukraine for personal gain or promotion. Do not strategize about war like it's a game if you have never experienced one. And I want to repeat this again, do not strategize about war like it's a game if you have never experienced one yourself. Now, the idea here is that most of the literature on IR about war and about peace has been traditionally written by scholars who have never gone through war themselves and have not seen the multiple layers through which peace comes with and all the problems that both war as well as peace bring forward. And this is typically the IR circles that have also been preoccupied with studying Russia, that have also maintained that type of geopolitical, realist and positivist lens to view the world and to view Russia's place in that world. That viewing was largely shaped by that Cold War framework that Olya mentioned earlier, where Russia was treated as this black box, sometimes to be feared, sometimes not to be understood, but it was generally not something you would open it up. And to a large extent, it seemed like that black box largely denoted that sense of epistemic superiority, that we know enough of Russia and we know what they are up to. What we have seen with the war is that that sense of epistemic superiority, in fact, turned out to have been an epistemic laziness, wherein engaging with non-democratic others, engaging with others in languages other than English simply proved to be untenable. And that epistemic laziness in traditional IR was continuously coupled with an epistemic arrogance towards knowledges coming from Eastern Europe or the so-called post-Soviet space, who, by the way, colleagues, scholars from the region had been trying to tell us all along about the structural preparations of a full-blown war and the structural patterns of violence that have been well existing in place before the war actually started. And many of these IR experts, even those who do IR by looking at military armament, warfare, strategizing, were also themselves caught by surprise to witness the weakness of Russia's military and its real-time decay as we witnessed Ukrainian tractors and pickup trucks demolishing Russian tanks. So if we are pitching this type of knowledge production against emotion or attachment or too attached or too detached, the knowledge that we have produced so far, or the knowledge that we have had from these seemingly detached, objective, neutral, and universally applicable knowledge, does not seem to add up with what we have seen unfolding in the field. So it seemed that we have studied Russia only in function to how susceptible and likely Russia was to disrupt the world order, the national and economic interest of powerful countries around the global north, and the high energy bills for the European consumers. But that, as it turned out, is not knowing Russia. That's merely knowing the potential damages that it could do to our purchasing power parity should it decide to engage in warfare. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vjosa, and thank you everyone for keeping, well, more or less to the time, considering that I took time to introduce everyone. I think we're perfectly within the time. You have raised, all of you, many important questions, many infuriating points, but also many thought-provoking points. And I hope that at least we take that away, at the very least, from today. I have a bunch of questions that have come up during the discussion, but let me first turn to the questions that come from the audience. And let me also remind everyone in the audience that if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat, or if you prefer to ask it yourself, you can, I think. So, right. So there's a question from Irene Dubel. I'm really sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Irene, who's joining us from Amsterdam. The question is, can you share some examples of feminist international solidarity, either within academia or potentially in feminist movements that have been useful and supportive in context of war and conflicts in the past or at present, be that the Balkans or Ukraine or elsewhere that we might be familiar with? This is the question to everyone, so if anyone has an answer to jump in. Okay. So I'm told that audience cannot unmute itself. So if you would, if you write to me in the chat, if you want to unmute yourself, we'll try to do that. Or alternatively, just pop the question in the chat. Okay, so back to answering the question. Does anyone have any examples on this? Oksana, I see you've unmuted yourself. Does that mean you have?
Sure, I can share. I've been part of a lot of spaces for the last 9 months, both activist spaces, academic spaces, sort of INGO spaces, and I think some of the knowledge production has definitely been one of the key issues of concern of Ukrainian scholars, activists, as well as the ability to see the agency and activism of women on the ground and actually divert the resources towards them. This is more of a feminist movement building strategy, and I'm kind of active in both of those spaces. In terms of funding, there have been really useful coalitions, both kind of in closed spaces, both and also open spaces around bringing to the table once again the conversation we've started hearing more and more about the need for feminist funding principles and showing the value of direct access of resources to feminist movements, flexible funding that allows them to respond to the context, and also really regarding local actors as those that carry the best knowledge, not in the academic sense, but in the sense of practice and embedded relationships inside communities. And there have been important, analytical reports coming out. I can share this in the chat by international organizations, but also kind of efforts at organizations saying, we've had enough of this bureaucratic structural donor funding. Can we do something using this moment to really influence the global infrastructure of philanthropy? And I'm very excited about this shift. I hope it leads to something really structural in terms of either new types of structures or new types of rules of the game. And speaking of spaces of reflection and academic exchanges, the ones that I have found the most productive for myself, but also the most sensitive were the ones where organizers, either Ukrainians themselves or people coming from other contexts, have actually thought through about who is on the panel, who is invited, and what those people can speak to about the lived experience of war and conflict, and really checking positionalities of speakers, either being activists, international organizations, or academics. And I noticed, maybe this is also my own bias, but maybe this is something about relating in a different way to activists. I've been on panel discussions with activists from the Balkans, Kosovan feminist speaking, based on her research and complications of nationalism and militarization and the effects that war does and will have on women's rights. And at the same time saying, look, we've been there, we've seen this, and yet we have also chosen to join the fight. And we understand that tension that you are finding yourselves in, maybe more than others, because we've embodied it. So it's understanding that actually this embodied knowledge can allow us to speak to each other and carry messages across from different temporalities, across from different contexts, in ways that we can hear each other and build on each other's lived struggles and lived experiences in different ways than a Western feminist who theorizes feminist peace and security would speak to me about concepts and approaches and things that have worked or not worked in other contexts based on her field experience, but not on her being embedded in that context. And I have really appreciated spaces where I kind of feel this level playing field among different speakers who say, well, this is my context, this is my struggle, this is what I have embedded, lived through, and suffered. And this is where my knowledge production comes from. And I'm not saying that we should like never have these spaces of different positionalities, but explicitly acknowledging them and speaking from those positions on how what I know and what I think influences where I come from, I think really centers that fight and makes it a feminist space. And this also feels like one of those spaces, by the way. I just want to acknowledge that, and I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you, Oksana. Thank you very much. Marina, then Vjosa, then Ola.
Yes, to add to what Oksana already said, I maybe wanted to give a couple of more specific examples that I wanted to bring up here. And one of those is the Central Eastern European Feminist Research Network that Teresa Hendel runs on Facebook. I would found that this one is particularly helpful in, spreading knowledge and also like in standing up for Ukrainian women feminists. But also I wanted to acknowledge a lot of support and solidarity coming from my colleagues from Central Eastern European countries who are either in these countries, and Poland welcomed a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and many Polish scholars either in Poland or another country have been contacting me from the very beginning, asking, like, providing support and like sending information about about positions and about like collecting funding, doing crowdfunding events and everything. And I felt actually that the current situation, this large-scale war, gave us additional push to solidarize together in the region and to question these practices of knowledge production, of the position of Central Eastern European feminists, as opposed to the Western scholars, of our scholarship, of what we produce in our languages. And also wanted to mention the solidarity networks within Ukraine, not necessarily only women's groups, but also, for example, the solidarity between LGBTQ activist organizations and feminist networks, with volunteers, with military. For example, there are cases when LGBTQ activists collect the equipment for soldiers and send them, and the soldiers know that this is coming from LGBTQ people, and and they're grateful to that, and this also changes the situation. And there was immense wave for solidarity and support between LGBTQ organizations across Europe. And that we had a very big Pride March, Equality March in Warsaw, with all Polish, Poland being notoriously known for very homophobic policies of the government. Even with this, still the LGBTQ people managed to, in civil society, managed to host huge event, which wasn't actually, I was there, it wasn't attacked, and there were a lot of Ukrainian flags, and Ukrainian flags were in many queer marches across Europe, even though for many organizations it is usually a matter of principle not to have any flags, because nationalism is often have a negative connotation and stands against homosexuality. But many LGBTQ organizations stated this year in solidarity with Ukrainians, they would allow Ukrainian flag and at their events. So I also wanted to bring this up to say that this solidarity between groups is even broader. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marina. Vjosa next, and then Ola. If we have time, we'll go to another question in the chat, but let's see how we go.
Thank you, Elena, and for the question that came from the audience. I wanted to, before I give a couple of examples that I know better from the Balkans as well, I also wanted to go back to that point I think I mentioned earlier about the risk, or the potential risk, at least, of how feminism or typologies of feminism, how they can also be turned into pedagogical politics of how one should be a feminist, or what kind of a feminist you should be, and what kind of feminism is legitimized within Ukraine and in the diaspora of Ukraine at the moment. Hand in hand with those pedagogical politics about strategizing, about territories, what needs to go where, and feminism is also not without risk for slipping in sometimes into these pedagogical politics as well. And we have to be cognizant of that. What do I mean specifically? There is a difference, and we should keep in mind the context. There is a difference in, raising a feminist agenda and being a feminist in Russia today, as opposed to being a feminist in Ukraine today. There was a difference for women in Black to protest in Belgrade against the war in 1999, and it was completely different for a Kosovo Albanian woman to be a feminist as the war was unfolding in their own houses, in their own towns in 1999. Context does matter. What we also risk doing when we are insisting on particular forms or varieties of feminism, what we risk doing is also the very idea that many times, as the experience, for instance, with the student movements in Kosovo in the 60s, in the 80s has shown, the illegal movement led by women, again in Kosovo, has shown, is that these women were fighting a double fight, right? Again, speaking of multitasking, even in times of war, you have to fight more than one. But we have to be cognizant of the layers and the stratification of when one takes precedence over the other. Again, we cannot possibly be strategizing and theorizing about feminisms if our own loved ones are not facing the barrel of a gun. So context still matters in this case. The other element I want to briefly touch upon is that when it comes to transnational or feminist solidarities, the issue here is not just for an agenda or this being an enterprise solely in times of the war. I myself am part of a Yugoslav Woman Plus collective. We are unpacking and unlearning knowledges about war and peace 30 years onwards after the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia. So this is a debate. These types of solidarities, these types of engagements in collective and other forms that are not geared towards, hyperproductivity, etc., they are a continuous process, and ideally they should continue as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Vilsa. And as we both know, they're very much a non-linear process. So there's a lot of learning and unlearning and relearning of things. And they're painful, but they're worthwhile. So Ola, last but not least, on answering this question.
Yes, my colleagues have already addressed various dimensions of solidarity, and I wanted to bring in another one that I think also should be acknowledged is academia as academic institutions and solidarity of institutions. One way that immediately comes to mind and that we've already mentioned in the course of the discussion is, of course, response to the war in terms of scholars at risk, right? And creating space, creating positions, creating funds to accommodate those. Another way that I would like to mention is institutional solidarity to Ukrainian members of staff. I was myself 6 weeks into a new job in the end of February, and I had no idea what to expect of my institution. And I must say that now with the time, when some time has passed and when I have had time to have conversations with Ukrainian colleagues based at different institutions, I must say I've been in a super supportive environment, right? Because I have colleagues who have had to operate this entire time in a mode of emergency without any recognition or acknowledgement of the fact that they are in emergency mode, without any adjustment to their regular workload, without any appreciation for the outreach that they are doing, by going to all these meetings, going to all these talks, by living up to no consideration for the for the stress that they are under, or the physical, financial, practical, logistical demands of having brought their family over or having to support their family from over here, right? So I think in that sense, I'd be interested to read a study on how different, academic institutions have lived up to the challenge, and in what ways, and how much diversity there is. But just purely anecdotally, I know lots of colleagues in very respectable European institutions who had zero to little to none support from their institutions in this process. And that's, of course, then becomes an extra burden to carry, and an extra insecurity and precarity in this.
Of course. Thank you, Ola. Yes, and some of those institutions does have scholars and prides itself on being a feminist institution or feminist and so on. So it's an important element to keep in mind. There's one question in the chat that I'm not sure if anyone has an answer to, but I'll ask it anyway. Eunice Yahuma, I'm sorry, Eunice, if I'm mispronouncing the name. If you could unmute, I would have asked you how to pronounce it. But the question is this: you have given a lot of examples of Western perspectives and attention switching, in this case positively, towards Ukrainian feminists. What about African perspectives? My understanding of the question is whether African perspectives have also shifted and whether you've noticed any changes there. I don't know if any of you have any experiences with this or any knowledge around this. So I'm just going to ask it in the open if anyone has an idea on or an understanding on whether these perspectives, first, what the perspectives have been and whether they've shifted. Please jump in. Okay, so maybe in one of the next events, we'll focus a little more on these. Oksana, were you?
I can speak to it very, very briefly,
Yes,
although it's also, I mean, I need to acknowledge that there is also lack of my understanding of the context, which maybe speaks to also hierarchies of knowledges and perspectives that we turn our attention to. I think, again, speaking or coming back to the understanding of decolonization as it applies to the context of Ukraine, there has been more attention and interest in understanding of what do other decolonized contexts or movements that are in the process of decolonization or have a post-colonial reflection have to say about our ongoing the ongoing war, Russia against Ukraine, and can we build solidarities against around that? And I think the initial understanding has also led to a fact that that both of our kind of communities know little about each other, about the nuances of the context. My colleague spoke to the fact that, a lot of the knowledge about our region is kind of Russia-centered. And I think we, as an activist and as an academic, I'm also learning about the impact of these kind of empires on different pockets of knowledge production in different regions, and understanding that at least politically and diplomatically, Russia has also been quite involved in a lot of countries in the African continent, those that have a socialist past or have been part of alliances with the former Soviet Union, and in that regard, potentially still hold political diplomatic alliance to Russia. Or also hold the position of being against the West and against the NATO. So I think what's coming up is this almost impossible binary that most of us find ourselves at certain having to choose a side in that binary without really being given a space of deconstructing it. So I think I'm actually kind of formulating this as I speak, but I think having those conversations and bringing together critical feminist thinkers from different contexts who find themselves in different parts of those binaries and who are getting tired of those binaries and having to choose, like, you're either fully with NATO, with the West, with the US, which we know is also very problematic, despite the fact that Ukraine is dependent so much right now in terms of the arms and everything on the support of the West, or saying if you're not with them, then you're with Russia, and all of this. Is there a way outside of that and beyond that? I said, I heard a phrase at a recent workshop that I really liked, globalization of the subaltern as a process of, knowledge sharing, knowledge production, but also disrupting this idea of always having to connect to a center in order to find, your point of leverage for solidarities, but seeing how we can find commonalities in our different contexts and we inform each other's analytical frameworks, but also what we know and how we know it. I think I potentially see a lot of future in that that goes outside or beyond the region of from the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, and really reaches into different parts of the world. But it is for sure a project to come, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Oksana. And Vjosa smiles probably because she remembers a lot of our discussion in the Yugoslav Women Plus collective around what happens when we have the West as non-audience. If we approach the West as non-audience, if our audience is elsewhere, what kind of knowledges and solidarities indeed can emerge? Ola, 1 minute before we wrap it up. Unmute, please. Yeah.
Yes. I just wanted to say, to kind of address this question by saying, what is often said with regard to Ukraine and more broadly Central Eastern Europe is that, this region is a black hole in the sense it's too far east for the global north and it's too far north for the global south. And I think in terms of the knowledge generated and actually the debates and the disconnection in the debates, this kind of plays out to 3 parallel knowledge spaces. And I think maybe if one of the things that this war will, give us in terms of the positives is actually the bridging of the debates and the understanding that many of the practices and the patterns that are happening are actually common. It's just you wouldn't imagine that this would happen in Ukraine or something because you've never been taught to think that way, right? And I think that there will be more dialogue between this. And I'm not at liberty to tell you much of the detail, but in our special forum, we have a whole section actually that would be looking at the war and the debate around the war from different points of view, including the global South, with several contributions that would bridge, the global East and the global South, and their take on what the global West is telling us. Thank you.
We end with a cliffhanger. This is perfect. Okay, so we are out of time, and I want to thank. Sorry, Rudy, we don't have time to address your question, but hopefully this discussion will continue in future events as well as on social media. But I want to thank from the bottom of my heart all the speakers for sharing such invaluable perspectives and knowledge, and for the audience that has turned out in a big number, and for all the questions that have been really, really engaging. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you soon at a different event that picks up on some of these questions.